Hello, this is the patrons only video for this week and podcast on Paul's early biography. And so basically this week, one of the texts we looked at was from Acts chapter 9, which gives us Luke's account of Paul's conversion. Now, of course, these are not videotapes. The book of Acts, as we can see by comparing it to Paul's own writings, Luke has his particular manner of presenting Paul. And it's a reminder to us that, we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We have four Gospels. And with those four Gospels, we can see that there are differences between them. There are things that we simply would not know for sure about the incarnation if we didn't have the Gospel of John. The pre-existence of Jesus is not very clear in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The virgin birth. Mark and John don't have the virgin birth. If we didn't have Matthew and Luke, we wouldn't know about the virgin birth. And so if we extrapolate this, we have to realize that if there was a Matthew volume 2 or a Mark volume 2 or a John volume 2, it would differ from the book of Acts as much as Luke is distinct from Matthew, Mark, and John. And so we have a little bit of this evidence when we look at how Acts presents Paul and how Paul presents himself in his own writings. And so what I want to do in this podcast slash video today is look a little at Paul's early biography from Paul's perspective, not from the perspective of Acts, but from the perspective of Paul himself. So the place I thought we should start is with Philippians 3. In Philippians 3, Paul gives a little bit of his own resume, his own CV of his past life. And as there's a key article, by the way, it was probably the most transformative article on Paul I ever read. And it's by Christopher Stendhal, who's passed now. He was a Lutheran minister, but called Paul and the Introspective Conscience of the West. Now, you may not have the same experience that I had, but as I read through that article, I kept saying, yes, yes, yes. Now, we have those kinds of, we find a scholar who says kind of what we haven't been able to put in words. But Christopher Stendhal, I think, in that article, which goes way back to the 1960s, makes it very clear the extent to which Martin Luther had affected our reading of Paul, to where when we read Paul's own biography, we saw Luther rather than Paul himself. And so, for example, Luther struggled with his conscience. Luther constantly felt like he wasn't good enough, and he couldn't measure up, and he couldn't keep the law. Luther felt like a failure. At the monastery, they said, "Get out of here, Paul. Go be a professor. You're a bad monk." Maybe he wasn't, but the perfectionist tendencies of Luther led him to feel like, I just can't measure up. And so Luther's aha moment was, I don't have to measure up. I am a sinner, but I am forgiven by God. And so I am at the same time both sinner and righteous as long as I'm always repenting. That was Luther's experience. And so justification for Luther was this great freedom that he from bondage that he felt. I don't think that's Paul's biography at all. In fact, I think Paul's biography is exactly the opposite. Paul felt like he was completely good enough. He was like the Pharisee in the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. I thank God that I'm not as other men, as this scoundrel of a tax collector over here. Why, I tithe of my spices and I do everything just right. I am blameless at keeping the law. So the great shocker for Paul was that even though he was perfect, he wasn't good enough. That was the shocker for Paul. And some of the evidence for that comes from Philippians 3 here. So Paul says, these other people that are boasting, I have as much or more. I have more to boast about than any of the so-called righteous Judaizers. This is what ticks Paul off so much at Antioch when Peter begins to say, well, maybe Jew and Gentile Christians shouldn't eat together because we don't want to become unclean. Paul's like, you hypocrite, good grief. You've never kept the law a day in your life, Peter. I was a Pharisee. Good grief. I kept the law scrupulously. I kept the law perfectly, I think Paul would say. But you, Peter, for you to pretend like you're going to, you don't care about the scruples of the law. This is a joke. We are justified by faith and not by works of law. I think Paul's background is completely opposite from Martin Luther's in that regard. They come to justification by faith from a completely different perspective. As E.P. Sanders put it, when Paul was converted, what he learned was that Christ was the way. Christ was the solution. Paul didn't know he had a problem. In fact, you don't find repentance. These are things from Stendel's article. You don't find the word repentance in Paul's writings very much. You find Paul repeatedly saying, "Follow my example. Follow my example. Follow my example. You want to know how to be a Christian? Follow my example." So even as a Christian, he didn't feel like a dirty, rotten failure of a scoundrel. Paul was a very self-confident guy for the most part. And I believe if we psychoanalyze his writings, we see exactly the same thing. So Paul says, I was circumcised the 8th day, like other Jews and Israelites. So ding, I got that on my resume. From the race of Israel, ding, I'm in the people of God. I'm a descendant of Abraham. Of the tribe of Benjamin, ding, I even know what tribe I'm from. I'm a Hebrew of the Hebrews. Now, again, this is an interesting distinction. If all we had were the book of Acts, we would be confident that Paul was a Hellenist. We would completely see Paul as a Hellenistic Greek-speaking Jew if all we had were the book of Acts. We would not know this side of Paul. Paul himself says, I'm a Hebrew of the Hebrews. We speak Aramaic in my house. And by the same token, now we would know that Paul could speak Greek pretty well because of his writings. But from Paul's own self-presentation, we would not know that he's from Tarsus. Paul never says he's from Tarsus in his own writings, although he does mention in Galatians that he went to Cilicia, where Tarsus is located. We would not know that Paul was a Roman citizen from his own writings. These are things that Paul says nowhere in his own writings. What he does say is that he is a Hebrew of the Hebrews. According to the law of Pharisee, what is a Pharisee? Well, Pharisees were separatists of a sort. They weren't like the Essenes, so they weren't. The Essenes sometimes actually went off to live in the desert. Pharisees didn't do that. Pharisees stayed. They were mostly in Jerusalem. They were mostly a Judean group. I think Josephus suggests that they may have been, 6,000 at one point in the 1st century BC. Pharisees followed the traditions of the elders, which were basically their Wesleyan discipline. It was this is how we keep the law. So the law says, what is it, 623 commands in the law? Well, how do you keep those 600 some commands? Well, the Pharisees, as we do, we shouldn't be hypocrites toward the Pharisees. We do it too. We have our own interpretations on how to keep the law. You have churches that don't celebrate Halloween, for example. That's an example of a tradition of that church. Our tradition in this church is we don't go to rated R movies, or our tradition in this church is we don't drink, or our tradition in this church is we don't do this or that or whatever. Those are traditions of the elders, like the Pharisees have. We have to have them because the Bible simply doesn't address every specific situation. And so we have to develop a kind of improvisation as to how to apply the principles to new and unforeseen situations, cloning, stem cell research, those sorts of things. Those aren't mentioned in the Bible. And so the Pharisees, of course, weren't big on improvisation. And so they developed these traditions, on how to keep the law. And of course, the Sadducees had them too. They were just different. And of course, the Sadducees may have said, we're just following the law, but they weren't, of course. They were following their traditions on how to apply the law. So the Pharisees were purists. Some of them belonged to dining clubs that only ate together so that they could keep the law, kosher laws properly. Now, here's the most significant thing, I think, for our purposes in 3:6, Philippians 3:6. Of course, I'm not there yet. According to zeal, I persecuted the church. Now, here it is. According to the righteousness in the law, blameless. Paul here states that he was blameless at keeping the law. I think that's important. Paul did not see himself as a moral failure. He did not come to justification by faith because of an introspective conscience that felt guilty. Paul came to Christ because Christ appeared to him, and Paul said, "Oh, so Christ is the solution to the human problem. That must mean that the law isn't." And he went from there. So as E.P. Sanders suggests, he worked from the solution back to the problem in his theology. He didn't come to the table with the problem. He didn't come knowing he had a problem. He came and Christ showed him the solution. And then he worked back to the problem, I would say. Okay, so there's Paul. By the way, Krister Stendahl makes it clear that Paul does not go on to say, all this was evil, and then I turned and became a Christian in a different religion. That's not what Paul says. Paul says that this is a good resume for a Jew. I had a good Jewish resume. But when you put it next to Christ, it was, it was like teeny tiny. It's like an ant next to a giant. So it's not so much that having these characteristics, Paul doesn't say it was bad. He just says that compared to Christ, it's nothing. This is nothing. These works of law don't matter a hill of beans when put next to the surpassing greatness of Christ. It's like rubbish. I mean, it's like you're going to try to get in on this. This isn't enough. It's not that any of these is bad, although persecuting the church is bad. But it's not bad to be a Hebrew of Hebrews. It's not evil. It's not a sin to be a Hebrew of Hebrews. It just doesn't mean anything, especially when you put it next to Jesus. Okay, Galatians 1:13 through 17. My former life in Judaism, I exceedingly persecuted the assembly of God, and I was destroying her. So he persecuted the church. That fits with Acts. I was ahead of others my age. I was zealous for the tradition of my fathers. That hints that he was a Pharisee. It also, I think, implies that he was not on the Sanhedrin. He may have been a worker or a steward or a helper of an assistant, of a high priest or of Gamaliel or something like that. He helped. He was not on the Sanhedrin. He was younger. A young man when he was persecuting the church. He could have been in his early 30s when he did it, or maybe late 20s. I think to be entrusted with this much authority, somewhere around the age of 30 would fit, or late 20s or early 30s when Paul was persecuting the church. God set him apart to preach among the Gentiles. God revealed his son in him. Now, Acts does not necessarily portray Paul as the apostle to the Gentiles. Now, to be sure, the book of Acts shows Paul going to the Gentiles. But the book of Acts just as well highlights Paul interacting with Jews. It also sees Paul interacting with Jews. And I'm not saying Paul, the book of Acts basically pictures Paul going to the synagogue when he arrives at a new place. He gets kicked out, and then he goes to the Gentiles. That makes perfect sense to me. I'm not in any way saying that isn't the case. However, Paul sees himself as the apostle to the Gentiles, and Paul sees Peter as the apostle to the Jews. Acts doesn't quite put it that way. In Acts 10, as we'll see next week in our walk through Acts, Peter sees himself as the one through whom God brought the message to the Gentiles. But Paul does not see Peter as the apostle to the Gentiles at all. For Paul, Peter is the apostle to the Jews, and he is the apostle to the Gentiles. So God set him apart from his mother's womb to preach to the Gentiles. And God revealed his son in him. Paul doesn't really talk about the road to Damascus experience in those terms. I've mentioned in one of my videos that in 2 Corinthians, he talks about an experience he has when he was taken up into the third heaven. He says 14 years ago. Now, the problem is when Paul's writing 2 Corinthians, probably 55, 56, 14 years before that would have been in the early 40s. And he was converted about the year 36. By the way, I don't have a PowerPoint on this, but I did mean today to talk a little bit about that chronology. I can't prove it, but one of the reasons why 36 is a good year to talk about, not about Paul's conversion was in 33, sorry, but to talk about 36 as the year that he left Damascus. So in 2 Corinthians, Paul's let down the wall of Damascus in a basket. And in 2 Corinthians, he says that the governor under King Aretas, do I have that on the next slide? I do. I have it at the bottom of the page. Okay, so I'll come back to that in a second, about the chronology of Paul. So Paul was ahead of others his age. He was zealous for the tradition of his fathers. God revealed his son in him. That experience, what I was saying about that experience, he talks about being taken up into the third heaven. Some have argued that might have been a reference to his seeing the light. And it's possible, but the numbers don't add up if you take them literally. The number 14 years ago doesn't add up. That 14 years ago from the writing of 2 Corinthians takes us back to the early 40s, whereas Paul was converted in the early 30s. Now, 14 could be a symbolic number. Seven is a symbolic number. 7 times 2 is 14. So it's possible that Paul is not referring to his Damascus Road experience. I'm not sure what to think, to be honest, about that one. But if you take it straightforwardly, it would imply that Paul had a pretty significant religious experience in the early 40s of the Common Era, AD. Okay, so one thing we learn about from Galatians 1 that we don't hear in Acts is that Paul spent about 3 years after he came to Christ up in the area of Damascus. He went to Arabia, which I've mentioned probably is not Saudi Arabia, but the Nabatean kingdom, which was just to the east of Damascus. You may have seen Petra in Indiana Jones' Temple of Doom. That's the capital of the Nabatean kingdom. King Aretas IV at this time would have been king. I don't know that Paul would have gone down that far south to Petra. I don't know where he went to Arabia. The fact that somebody was waiting, the ethnarch was waiting to arrest him, suggests to me, so the ethnarch under King Aretas, he says in 2 Corinthians 11, 32 and 33, that the ethnarch under King Aretas was guarding Damascus to arrest him. This suggests that when he went to Arabia, he got into big trouble. And, you can see Paul, doing a Jonah, can't you? God's going to destroy you all, you sinners, if you don't repent. Although, it is a question. Did Paul sense his calling to the Gentiles this early? From the book of Acts, it feels like it's when Paul's on his first missionary journey on the island of Cyprus that he really begins to sense that he's called to the Gentiles the most. It really feels like it was a kind of a growing sense he had, not something he immediately knew from the moment of his having the vision. So that Paul would be preaching to Gentiles in Arabia that's a curious thought that doesn't seem to quite fit that beginning moment of his Christianity. But he must have ticked off the Nabateans pretty significantly for the ethnarch to be waiting to arrest him. And I have to believe that Paul the choleric, Paul the loudmouth, Paul the in-your-face kind of personality here, that he probably must have said some things that ticked off the Nabateans. Now, it could be, it's hard to know. It's just hard to know why Paul went to Arabia. I would sure like to know more about that. Well, as I said, he's lowered down the wall in a basket. So what's going on here? Well, in the year 36, the guy Herod Antipas that beheaded John the Baptist. Herod Antipas lost control of Damascus briefly. Well, I think he lost control. The Romans lost control possibly of Damascus briefly in between the reign of Tiberius and Caligula. And so there was a little bit of a time there where Herod Antipas wasn't quite in control of Damascus. So there was a void around the year 36 that would have allowed the Nabateans to have more control of the city. And so there's an article I read in the Journal of Biblical Literature several years ago that suggested that the year 36 is a good year for Arab control over Damascus, and that this might be a time when the ethnarch might have enough authority to try to arrest someone like Paul, maybe to take him back to the Nabatean kingdom to put him on trial for whatever he preached when he was there. So if in fact that's true, if Paul was lowered down the wall of Damascus in 36, and this was after 3 years after he became a Christian, then that would put his conversion at about 33 AD 33. Well, I think that's, Galatians 1:18. After 3 years, he went to Jerusalem to visit Peter, saw James. He stayed 15 days. Then he went to Syria and Cilicia. Again, we get the impression from Acts that Paul preached rather publicly in the Hellenistic synagogues, that he preached Jesus like Stephen had. We get the impression from Galatians that it was much more of a hush-hush, more covert action. And of course, you would expect it to be somewhat covert because I imagine Paul doesn't have friends, even though this is maybe 3 years later. Paul still doesn't have friends in Jerusalem. He betrayed them. Well, okay, this has been some thoughts on the Apostle Paul from Paul's perspective, giving us a sense of how Paul would have presented these early days. And somewhat now we can look at Acts 9 and ask, how is Luke, what distinctive does Luke have in his perspective on Paul? Well, thank you. We'll continue our way through Acts.